Crusader, no remorse. For a lack of a formal term, this is an isometric shooting game, the only one that I know of, to be exact. It was developed by Origin Systems and initially released for MS-DOS in August of 1995. The game takes place in 2196 where, due to economic troubles, all countries on Earth eventually merged into the single entity known as the World Economic Consortium. The WEC is a tyrannical government which has led to the creation of an organized resistance movement. You play as a nameless captain who defected to the resistance after the consortium butchered your squad for failing to follow orders. From there, the entire game consists of 15 solo missions where you perform various tasks for the resistance, such as bombings, prisoner liberations, etc. The game starts by throwing you into the deep end. You're given a short briefing by Resistance General Maxis in a live-action full-motion video. Those were definitely in vogue in '95 and even more so at Origin, who is also responsible for the Wing Commander franchise. As I'm sure you've noticed, the General's name is a nod to another Electronic Arts studio. Crusader has a bunch of references, like an article on System Shock's Shodan in one of its included documents. Anyway, you're teleported into the first mission without a trace of help from the game, and the first thing that happens is you getting spotted and an alarm being sounded. At that point, you better have studied the game's controls, or it's gonna be a real struggle. The game would have very strongly benefited from a proper tutorial because it has a relatively unique and complex control system. Interestingly, the most similar system I know of is that of Arma 3. The feeling of lostness is accentuated by the fact that, for some reason, the first mission is also one of the longest in the game, at around an hour and 40 minutes on my end. When you finally accomplish your task, you are teleported out of the level and into the rebel base. From there, you can listen to your fellow soldiers, buy new gear, and receive your next mission's briefing. Then you teleport into the next level, and that cycle repeats until the game ends. The plot of Crusader is fairly run-of-the-mill for a story set in a military setting. You've got classic archetypes with classic twists. As I've mentioned, the bulk of the narration is delivered through live-action footage with an expectable amount of cheese.
The rest of the job falls to you, Captain.
Overall, though, the acting is passable. Certainly not a distraction. The plot isn't there merely as an excuse to go shoot things, however, because the narration is fairly present throughout the whole game, including in-mission cutscenes that stop you in your tracks. The soundtrack is enjoyable if you're a fan of 90s electro. That's not exactly my preferred genre, but it was listenable. The rest of the soundscape is pretty good though. Weapons and explosions feel punchy and sound effects don't get old.
Intruder denied. Security!
The visuals are quite mediocre. Most of the levels have an identical look, only with a different layout, with an industrial warehouse aesthetic. Sometimes things get switched up a little and you play in something like an office building, but in any case, the art direction is really unremarkable. I do know Crusader was a bit special when it came out because its resolution was higher than average. From where I'm standing, the edges weren't off. Putting aside the way they look though, the levels are quite enjoyable to play through. The game presents the player with many different interesting situations, some light puzzling, and occasionally a bit of platforming. It's longer than I anticipated at somewhere between 15 and 20 hours, but I didn't feel like it overstayed its welcome by the end. Things remain fresh enough all the way through. The game offers 4 difficulty levels. I went for the loose cannon mode and I found the game to be well balanced. Weak enemies are properly weak, strong enemies will stop you in your tracks, and item distribution is fair. I also went back to the first level with Weakened Warrior for the sake of comparison and found it to be too easy. Things die too fast, you take little damage, and the game is too liberal with item distribution. Seriously, you can find a rocket launcher by exploring the first level. The gameplay is the main star of the show, and here's how it plays. By default, the arrow keys are tank controls. Combined with control, they let you do acrobatics like rolling and jumping. Combined with alt, they let you strafe. And combined with shift, they let you move faster. For immediate access, all these movement options are also replicated on the extended keys and the numpad. And finally, there's the other traditional controls like shooting, using items, etc. If you don't want to rely on your keyboard, there's a modern alternative I'll come back to later. The entire game is designed around these somewhat intricate maneuvers. Simply running in front of an enemy, unholstering and unloading will only serve to get you killed. Instead, the game makes the player frail enough that you have to strafe behind cover and shoot enemies at a distance, or roll into view to unload then roll back into cover, etc. Unexpectedly, this is a very quick save quick load heavy game. Every single encounter I do the old song and dance of F5 and F4 until I get past. Given how easy it is to die from both the enemies and the environment, and given the complete lack of autosaves, I think the game was designed with quick load spamming in mind. The main game loop consists of advancing through rooms, shooting whatever's in your way, reading terminals for codes and fighting keycards, then advancing to the next rooms. To achieve that, Crusader gives the player an array of combat options. You have pistols, shotguns, SMGs, rocket launchers, and a bunch of energy weapons that drain your shield. All of those useful for the situations you might expect. But then you also have tactical supplements with mines and remote control spider bombs. It can all be acquired from a decently annoying but thankfully skippable merchant at the rebel base, or it can be looted from enemies. All of this combines to give the player a healthy amount of options to tackle the situation they need to deal with. Got a camera in the next room you can't shoot without being spotted? Send a spider bomb to it. Got a mech that's giving you trouble? Lure it to a choke point where you've placed a bunch of mines. There's multiple solutions for everything. In addition, the environments have a nice degree of interactivity. Most things that aren't walls can be destroyed, and there's valves scattered throughout the levels which enable traps against your enemies. This opens up even more strategic options. For example, you can shoot through a glass panel and hit enemies before they know you're here. It also means you can't sit behind a crate and gun down everyone, because that crate will eventually be broken. Oh yeah, and Crusader had GoldenEye syndrome 2 whole years before that game came out. Unfortunately, the gameplay is often rough around the edges. There are times where the reticule feels like it's on an enemy but you're really shooting next to him. Later in the game, there's posted rocket launcher enemies that will kill you in one hit the second they see you, and the controls are simply not responsive enough to deal with that, so the only way I found to reliably deal with them is to shoot or bomb these guys while they're off screen, which I don't find elegant. Speaking of off screen, by default the camera is fixed on positions in the level, which can lead to annoying situations where you're immediately spotted as the camera snaps to another position. There's a button that lets you center the camera on the captain, and with that you'll find cheesing tactics because you can see the enemies before the AI acknowledges you're here, and that means free kills. The control system also really shows its cracks when you need fine controls. I mentioned platforming earlier. Sometimes you need to jump and run to avoid electrified squares, or you'll need to jump on a platform. In those moments, controls feel sluggish and frustrating more than intricate. The last major complaint I have is about the game's refusal to communicate with the player. I alluded to that at the beginning, but the game expects the player to know all of its moving parts before playing. There's no tutorial to become familiar with the controls, the game doesn't tell you what any of the weapons and items do, there's no info on the environmental hazards you encounter, etc. The worst instance of that is when I figured out only just before the final mission of the game that you could upgrade the size of your energy reserve. I didn't suspect anything because I thought the small size came from the difficulty I selected. I still got by tactically chugging energy cubes, but it was definitely a frustrating discovery. To find most of this info, you need to read through all of the game's included docs, not just a manual. On GOG, those docs are optional goodies, so I suspect many people also never learn about all that stuff. I really don't understand why a game that loves cutscenes couldn't also have all that content in-game. The only positive is that you, who's watching this, have been warned and you're now unlikely to have these frustrations. Oh, and one minor issue I also have is the inability to reload weapons. It's annoying having to either empty your magazine into a wall or enter the next room with a penalty. As for playing the game today, you can grab it on GOG for extremely cheap. It comes pre-configured with DOSBox and includes all of the game's documents as PDF. I did encounter one technical limitation, however. Of all the rendering methods DOSBox offers, the only one that has full-screen nearest neighbor upscaling is OpenGLNB. Everything else either doesn't scale or uses bilinear filtering, which doesn't look the sharpest. Unfortunately, on my end, The renderer I mentioned made FMVs heavily stutter, so I had to settle for something with a blurry output instead. Strangely enough, since I beat the game, I also bought a new graphics card, and with that one I don't have any stutter. Unfortunately, all I can say is that your mileage may vary. Another point on playing the game today. Earlier I mentioned there's an alternative to using the many PC commands, and that would be using a controller. From my research, DOSBox only lets you bind one key to one button, which I find lacking given the amount of controls on offer. What I did then is add the game to my Steam library. Steam has a fantastic controller configuration tool that can be used on every game, including external ones. With that, I built a configuration you're seeing on screen, which I find quite comfortable. The D-pad combined with shoulder buttons gives access to the full set of movements. The right stick lets you scroll through your inventories, and the face button are used for common actions. Although you could learn the entire keyboard scheme, I find the usage of a controller far more intuitive for this type of action games. Crusader was also ported to the Saturn and the PlayStation in '97. I have no experience with either of these, so I'll paraphrase Digital Foundry and the critics of the time. According to them, console versions are effectively scaled down from the original. The resolution is worse, the level of complexity is worse, and the controls are awkward. On the flip side, they do have proper scrolling, which the DOS release would have benefited from. In spite of all the issues I mentioned throughout my review, I had a good time playing Crusader. The gameplay felt refreshing and nothing overstayed its welcome. It gave me a good challenge and the action felt engaging across the entire game. You will feel the shortcomings I talked about, and you might end up finding the controls to be too antiquated to enjoy the game. But I think it deserves a shot, at the very least.